Okay. Good afternoon, Professor Horne. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I want to say to the audience that Professor Horne is one of the world's most prolific, and I do mean that prolific and influential historians of race, empire, colonialism, and the global political economy. He is a John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History at the African American Studies at the University of Houston, and the author of more than 40 books, and I'm sure it's over 50, examining the interconnections of history, the histories of Africa, the African diasporas, the United States, Latin America, Asia, and the wider world. A distinguished scholar of Black liberation movement, settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, labor, and international relations. Professor Horne is best known for groundbreaking works such as The Counter-Revolution of 1776, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, and what is the last one? And the White Pacific. His scholarship challenges conventional historical narratives by placing African, indigenous, and anti-colonialist struggle at the center of world history. Throughout his career, Professor Horne has demonstrated the histories of slavery, capitalism, white supremacy, and colonial expansion are deeply intertwined and continue to shape contemporary geopolitics. It work spans over 5 centuries and 6 continents, offering a truly global perspective of the rise of the modern world and the evolution of U.S. power. Widely recognized for both his scholarly rigor and his accessible public engagement, and I can testify to that as well. Professor Horne is a sought-after speaker whose lectures and interviews continue to inspire students, scholars, activists, and audience around the world to rethink history through a global Black perspective. Please join me in welcoming Professor Horne. So, Professor Horne, welcome. I heard you on one of your podcasts recently describe your work ethic, and I would love for you to share that because you've been so prolific and so accurate in what you're writing. So I thought you would be helpful for us to hear.
Well, I think it begins with my youth. As I've said many times, I was a child laborer. Now, I don't support child labor, needless to say. I think it's a barbaric relic. But from the age of about 6 or 7 in St. Louis, Jim Crow, St. Louis, Missouri, I was a newspaper boy, running the risk of being robbed, which of course was quite a shaping experience. And from selling newspapers, I began to read what I was peddling, particularly the comic strips and the sports pages. I still read the sports pages, comic strips, not so much. And then I think partly as an educational device and partly as a way to provide a certain kind of childcare. My mother would send myself and my 2 sisters to the St. Louis Public Library. And there I began to read biographies from an early age. And to fast forward to today, I start the day by going through various online sites, U.S. newspapers from the Boston Globe to the San Francisco Chronicle to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and a number of others in between. And then the Mail and Guardian of South Africa, the Herald of Zimbabwe, allafrica.com, which covers the continent, asiatimes.com, which covers that continent, Guardian, UK, and hard copies of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Houston Chronicle, and the Financial Times of London, which I find particularly valuable. And then I get in the mail hard copies of the LA Times, Washington Post, China Daily, and as well, I try to survey a number of magazines: The Economist, The New Yorker, The Nation, The New Republic, The Week, which covers mostly US, sort of a compendium, a roundup, and People magazine, because I'm supposed to be a scholar of the entertainment industry, so I read People magazine, and a number of others that are now escaping me. And I try to read not only in the areas that I'm researching or have researched, basically a book or two a week with regard to those. And then I try to read beyond what I'm researching in terms of whatever might capture my interests, for example, like bestsellers. I'll probably read the Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan book, Regime Change, which is now the number one New York Times bestseller, covering the first year or so of the Trump regime. And uh, uh, talking about work, I visit many archives and do a lot of traveling as a result. So I usually work on two or three books at the same time. And I must say, it's oftentimes a pleasure to talk about stuff that I haven't published, because oftentimes I get ideas from people who hear me. So let me say
Yeah.
that go ahead.
Yeah. On a typical day, what time do you start and what time do
Oh,
you
I
end?
see. Uh, well, when I'm in Texas, where I'm not right now, I usually start at 5 a.m. and I
Okay.
usually go to bed about 9 p.m. Uh, that's my regime, generally 7 days a week.
Would you say you stop working at five, is it 5 to 5 or 5 to 7?
No, no, I wouldn't say I stop. I continue. I mean, obviously, I stop to eat,
I mean, yeah, to sleep. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you
and
go
I
ahead.
consume lots of media, uh, especially on YouTube, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
When Netflix was sending out DVDs, I would devour three or four a week
Wow.
easily.
Okay. The reason I bring it up is because it seems like your work ethic is something to model, especially in today's time, meaning that it appears that we've sort of fallen asleep and we have missed the rise of the right to the point that now it's fascist. And we really need to dedicate ourselves to the work that's necessary to sort of pull ourselves forward. So that's why I was bringing up your work study. You sound like you're just very specific. You're very you put in at least a 12-hour day, and that doesn't include the traveling that you're doing, and like you
Mhm.
said, some of the entertainment. I think as well. But I will ask you one question on
Mhm.
sports. What do you think of LeBron James' move to the Sixers?
Well, thank Brad Stevens of the Boston Celtics executive office traded Jaylen Brown for reasons that still remain unclear despite his press conference. And by that trade to the 76ers, even without LeBron, they had created the nucleus of a championship team in
Yep.
Philadelphia. But having said that, the fact remains that there are four leading squads going into the season: San Antonio, Oklahoma City, New York Knicks, the 76ers. It's not a done deal that the 76ers will prevail by June.
Right. Right. Yeah, they're just in the mix, and obviously
Mm-hmm.
injuries can occur,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't know who's going to show up that we haven't expected.
Exactly.
Yeah. But on to business. One of the things I wanted to ask is, can we, or do you feel like it's beneficial to make public to correct anyone when they use the word plantation and to call it exactly what it is, a slave labor camp?
Well, it depends. I mean, Correct. I would say it's appropriate and proper to use that phrase, yourself, myself, in oral presentations and writing, media appearances, etc. If you do correct someone, I think it should be done gently because our forces are not formidable, and people in the United States tend to be very sensitive about that sort of thing. So I don't want to unnecessarily alienate anyone.
Yep, and that certainly makes sense. It's the idea is just to bring more clarity. Like
Hmm.
each
Hmm.
of us as individuals, we had the power of creating culture. And
Hmm.
so I thought, looking at it in a more, or even a different word, but looking at plantation, it sort of covers up the violence. It covers up the exploitation. So
Hmm.
that's why I brought it up.
Hmm.
So if you
Hmm.
hear if you hear anybody say it, just say it came from me, Marlo Mason.
Okay.
um, so the other thing, we talked about the counter revolution of
Hmm.
1776, and what I don't think our audience gets is what the counter revolution is countering. So if you could start off by talking about what was the revolution, and then talk about the counter revolution, and then what the white left is missing about this narrative.
Well, let's approach this from a number of different angles. Many of our friends on the left in their political education classes, they are taught a certain scheme. That is to say, primitive communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism. And then you read some of our friends on the left write that one of the marvels of the United States, unlike Western Europe, is that it did not have the fetters of feudalism to overcome. Now, that is a statement that obscures more than it reveals. I mean, first of all, those familiar with the Hudson River Valley might want to counter that. And secondly, it's misleading because it has overcome slavery. And in terms of that particular scheme, uh, that in some ways is more of a fetter to overcome, more of a chain to overcome than feudalism. And then I think that too often the United States is looked at as a thing in itself. I mean, it's not even looked at in terms of its relationship to the mother country. As I point out in my 1776 book, I try to draw a connection between the so-called Glorious Revolution in London in 1688, wherein the wings of the monarch were clipped insofar as he had the African slave trade under his thumb, and the merchants desired a piece of the action. And as other scholars have pointed out, there's a book called Freedom's Debt, published by the UNC Press, University of North Carolina Press, which points out that the debt with regard to so-called bourgeois democracy in London is owed to, in many ways, Africans. Because what happens is that once the wings of the monarch are clipped, the monarchs enter the slave trade, quite aggressive way, descending on Africa with the formidable energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, shipping them across the Atlantic, which creates, needless to say, quite a bit of profit, not to mention quite a bit of resistance. Uh, in the Caribbean, the enslavers and those like the enslavers are outnumbered tremendously, which then leads to a great trek to the North American mainland. But that particular barrier is not necessarily overcome on the verge of the U.S. Civil War in 1860. You got a black majority in Mississippi, Louisiana, likely South Carolina, elsewhere, which creates tremendous restiveness, to put it mildly. But returning to the late 1600s, 1700s, you also see the influx of Africans to the North American mainland. It creates a particular problem for Georgia, which borders Spanish Florida, and Spanish Florida, or the Spanish in their provinces have been arming Africans, say in Cuba, ever since the early 1500s. And so they're sending armed Africans across the border, stirring up what happens to be Stonewall's Revolt, 1739 in South Carolina. And then you have the British, who have a so-called manpower deficit since they have India and other colonies to contend with. They begin to form Negro regiments, who then are accused credibly of roughhousing and manhandling settlers in New England, which does not win London many plaudits. And London then engages in the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, wherein mighty blows are struck against the French in Quebec and the Spanish in Florida, for example. Temporarily, the British take over Florida, particularly St. Augustine, and take over Quebec. And then the traditional narrative kicks in where they want taxes from the settlers to pay for this apparent asset that has been doled out to the settlers. Then there's the land question with regard to the Royal Proclamation, where in London is tiring of expending blood and treasure fighting Native Americans so that landlords like George Washington can prevail. In my book, The Capital of Slavery, I cite from his last will and testament, and he's one of the largest landowners on planet Earth, mostly because of taking land from the indigenous. And so you see this growing divergence, this growing disconnect between the mother country and the colonists. I'm working on a book now, which I'm tentatively calling The Counter-Revolution of 1790, because in 1790, what happens is that after Spain helps George Washington and the company oust the British from the so-called 13 colonies, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson then begins to press the Spanish, who have Florida returned to them, to cut off their policy of providing sanctuary for Africans fleeing from Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia, for example. And the Spanish accede. This is taking place as the same decade as the vaunted Bill of Rights are being promulgated. Also, as I'm going to talk about in this coming book, London is working with the indigenous. Look up the character Billy Bowles, Bowles, to create indigenous protectorates in lieu of what becomes U.S. states on the North American mainland. And such activity contributes to the War of 1812. Well, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the counter-revolution consists of overthrowing London's policy of basically stopping at the Appalachian Mountains, as opposed to moving westward and overthrowing indigenous polities, for example. And the counter-revolution also consists of the policy towards the Negro question. Now, you can point out, as some have, that it takes a while for London to get straight on the Negro question. Of course, they're involved, along with other European powers, the Spanish and the French, in trying to stymie the Haitian Revolution. But then again, by 1807, they know that the jig is up. The Haitian Revolution triumphs in 1804, and they withdraw from the African slave trade. It takes a while for the so-called Revolutionary Republic to catch up with that policy, just as they abolished slavery in the 1830s, and doesn't happen in the United States until the 1860s with titanic bloodshed. So, as I've said to a number of audiences, Black people celebrating 1776, it's like turkeys celebrating Thanksgiving. Or it's like a bad New Yorker cartoon, whereby the Black figure in the cartoon says, the good news is I was part of a great leap forward of humanity. The bad news is that I was enslaved. I mean, what kind of nonsense is that? I mean, it leads to a certain kind of white nationalism, I'm afraid to say. I was on a DSA educational just a week or so ago. It's online. And somebody asked me a very informative question, which is one of the reasons I engage in these sorts of discourses, which is why hasn't the Haitian Revolution been seen as the triumph of the working class? Because you have the unpaid sector of the working class that overthrows their employers and sets up rule. And it doesn't speak well for many of our friends on the left who have the advantage of someone who died in the late 19th century, for example, of being able to absorb historical currents, literature, because the literature continues to flow. I mean, let me recommend the interviews I do with scholars on KPFK FM Los Angeles that are posted on the Activist News Network. One of the scholars I interviewed recently, Jeremy Popkin of the University of Kentucky, his book, The First Emancipation, he points out that in the 1790s, when I'm talking about the counter-revolution of 1790 in North America, the French Revolution is moving towards abolition. So you can't say, as many do, that abolition was not on the historical agenda as the United States was being formed. Look at the French Revolution. Now, of course, Napoleon comes in and tries to execute a counter-revolution. To a certain extent, he does, but not in Haiti itself. And, you know, to the extent that we're trying to engage in social science, which I hope we are trying to do, we realize that science advances. I mean, at one time, phlogiston and phrenology were considered scientific. They no longer are because people studied, learned, published. It's taking a long while for what it seems to me to be basic elemental concepts to be absorbed by all too many.
I agree with you. And when the Haitian Revolution isn't considered a working class revolution, I also see the connection between Marx, not necessarily looking at the American slaves as part of the working class as well. Is that accurate?
Well, in The Nation, the recent review I did of Joseph Ellis's book, The Great Contradiction, Ellis had been considered a leading scholar of the founding of the United States, but in many ways he does a 180 in his latest book. And as I say in the review, it's like the Pope reconsidering Catholicism. And I use the term unpaid sector of the working class repeatedly in that review. Uh, but once again, I would prefer to put out ideas and have folks explore those ideas more so than critique those who are gone to the great beyond and are not able to speak for themselves.
Gotcha, gotcha. And so when we talk about the white left, what is the opportunity for them without critiquing them in terms of in terms of being able to move forward?
Well, I think that events, look, we're facing a very dangerous crisis right now in the United States of America. You saw that speech that Mr. Trump gave a few days ago, where he hinted strongly, to put it euphemistically, that any election that his side does not win is fraudulent, which sets the stage for declaring invalid any Republican defeats in November 2026. I had the opportunity to be in Chile before the coup of September 11th, 1973. And I recall the folks and the comrades reassuring me that Chile had this strong democratic tradition, and any idea of fascism was left-wing fear-mongering. But we all saw what happened after September 11th, 1973. And so it's not unusual for folks on our side to make inaccurate estimates, inaccurate evaluations. And I would like to think, reference here, Ellis's book, for example, who's not a radical, he's basically a liberal, where he's reconsidering. And in fact, he says, as I mentioned in the Nation Review, that he's reconsidering because of Trumpism, for example. Uh, Now, interestingly enough, he suggests that he may have underestimated the toxicity of white supremacy, which I think is a fair statement, although I add the addendum that he should also look at class collaboration, because I think that since many of our friends on the left, they get upset, many of them get upset when you start talking about racism, for example, for whatever reason. Supposedly, as Senator Sanders has suggested when he was trying to explain the November 2024 victory of Mr. Trump, he said it was due to identity politics. Now, I don't think he meant the identity politics of Zionism. Usually, because this is a very amorphous term. Usually, when our friends on the left use that phrase, they're talking about Black liberation movement. But you could, as we have just suggested, you could see the Black question in many ways as a version of a class question, insofar as you're dealing with the unresolved grievances of the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, who now are 90% working class and oftentimes are in the forefront of union struggles and vote most heavily against the right wing, even criticized when we vote 8-2 against the right wing, for example. That's not enough. Was it? I think it's Wilson Pickett, although, 99 and a half just won't do. It has to be 100. So when it comes to the Negro question, people have very high standards.
Yes, there you go. I see you're very diplomatic these days.
Well, I have too many antagonists, and I'm trying to cut down that number.
Yeah, well, I can understand. You don't need the heat. Um, Next question. There is a 20, 2007, 2027 National Defense Authorization Bill. It just passed
Hmm.
and it's going to the Senate. And
Hmm.
one piece of it actually merges
Hmm.
the military, the defense
Hmm.
sector, and the supply chain of the United States with Israel.
Hmm.
And I want to know if you had any comments about that.
Well, I recommend the interview that Adam Smith, who is a congressman, I think from Pacific Northwest, gave with breakingpoints.com. Crystal Ball, I think the interviewer's name was, because he went over that issue at some length. And I think he was against it, then he was for it, or maybe he was for it and then he was against it. But he was explaining it as a sort of co-production model, for example. Obviously, in light of the fact that the scuttlebutt out of Israel now is that the right wing is not upset necessarily with the state of affairs, because the United States is battering Iran with Israel standing on the sidelines, and Iran is battering the Gulf states, who Israel sees as long-term, if not present-day antagonists. So what's not to like, particularly with the elections coming up in a few months, for example? So obviously, Israel wields significant influence, to put it mildly, in US politics. Uh, the New York Times has been reprimanding Mayor Mamdani for suggesting that if Mr. Netanyahu comes to New York, he'll arrange for him to be arrested.
Yep.
Then what happened on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I think a Jewish guy and then an Asian guy was stabbed. And then they were trying to blame that on Mamdani because he's creating this atmosphere. So basically, what happens in the United States, as I said, these people on the left, racism, man, that's a 19th century issue. But uh, Zionism is not identity politics, although here you have a state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity. So obviously you have all these double standards that they're hardly commented upon. And it drives many Black people up the wall. More to the point, it, it makes them lose confidence in the overall U.S. left and make it reluctant to make alliances and coalitions because you feel these people don't know what they're talking about. I mean, what country are they living in? They're sort of out of it, basically. Or you take the point of view that they do know what they're doing. They're engaged in a cover-up, basically. They don't want to confront white nationalism. They don't want to confront the reality that emerged from the U.S. Civil War and that is still relevant, which is that liberal and left forces per the Union Army, 1861 to 1865, has difficulty prevailing against the right wing unless you issue an Emancipation Proclamation and 200,000 Black men join the Union Army. And today, I don't care how you torture the numbers, and I've heard some rather creative torturing of the numbers with regard to the Euro-American working class and middle class. It's difficult for the liberal and left forces to prevail, which should tell you something. I mean, we're oftentimes so, well, Trump won because the Democrats were not sufficiently left. They should have run a social democratic campaign. Then Mamdani wins every borough except Staten Island, the headquarters of the settler descendant working class and middle class, and people have nothing to say. And so, as I said, when this sort of thing happens, many Black people, these people are out of it. Either they're out of it or it's something much more malevolent.
Yep.
They're intentionally out of it because they don't want to confront reality, perhaps because they feel that there's something in the status quo that they find appealing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to, we can make a lot of, I guess, prognosis of why they're doing it, but the behavior definitely isn't helping. No question
Oh,
about
God.
it.
Well, now you're being diplomatic.
That's right. I learn fast.
I see.
But speaking of double standards, what do you think of the Saudis being able to get to enrich uranium?
Well, as you know, Mr. Trump, he makes the deal. He gets MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, to fly all the way across the Atlantic to Washington, cuts the deal, and then the very next day says, well, you have to sign the Abraham Accords, which involves recognition of Israel. For example, the Saudis have made it clear that that's not happening unless there's a meaningful progress towards a Palestinian state. If I didn't know better, I would think Mr. Trump is trying to get MBS killed. I mean, you saw what happened to Sadat. Go on YouTube
Yeah.
and see what happened to Anwar Sadat by his own military. The assassination was filmed in real time. It's quite startling to this very day. And speaking of Saudi Arabia, let me mention that just this week, my latest book dropped, Slavery and the Slave Trade and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism. Long subtitle, but it's comprehensive. North Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, West Asia, Ottoman Turkey, Russia, and Western Europe. And the Saudis play a major role because, as I point out in the latter chapters, as late as 1957, they're bringing Black slaves to Washington, D.C. You know, and I'm doing a talk at Midnight Books in Los Angeles tomorrow, and what I'm going to try to do is draw a parallel between the anti-Blackness of the Atlantic slave trade and the anti-Blackness of the slave trade heading north to Egypt. Egypt is a major enslaving power, not to mention to Turkey, and of course, enslaved Africans being sold in Mecca, for
Yep.
example, which is
Yep.
difficult to interfere with since you're not supposed to go to Mecca during certain moments unless you're a Muslim, for example.
So
So
Which book is this that talks about this?
It just dropped this week, Slavery and the Slave Trade and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism. That's
Yeah,
enough
yeah. I
to,
just wanted to repeat it again,
yeah,
so the audience would know.
yeah, but as I said, it deals with all of the aforementioned nations and regions.
And if there's a takeaway that people should get that you want people to get from the book, what would you say?
Well, this book is pursuing a number of agendas. One, I'm trying to provide the backstory to these disastrous U.S. escapades in Iraq, Libya, Iran, for example, by looking at the U.S. relations with that part of the world, actually beginning in the late 18th century and then marching forward uh, to today. And I would say that that's the major lesson, trying to provide historical context for that. And then shedding light on Egypt. Egypt has plays a very malignant role in this book. And it reminds me of the United States. I mean, you have this brief period during the New Deal, 1933 to 1945, which is driven by very unique circumstances that leads to labor organizing, Social Security, unemployment compensation, etc. And to a certain extent, we of the left have been surviving on that reputation for decades now. And likewise, Egypt, setting aside the brief period of the G.A. Nasser regime from the early 1950s going forward, the role has been very malignant. On the one hand, being either a colony or a neo-colony of the Ottoman Empire, then Britain, and then trying to establish an African empire heading south towards the equator, with Sudan in particular being pulverized. The book starts in 1875, 1876 with Confederate officers recruited by Egypt to lead an invasion of Ethiopia, to try to turn Ethiopia into another source for enslavement, for example. And another possible critique that comes out of this book is that then, as now, you have many Black people celebrating, admittedly, the marvels of ancient Egypt, but we need to look at some of the malignancies of contemporary Egypt, recent Egypt, for example. And then there's the construction of whiteness. Uh, the president of Meta Facebook is considered to be white, unquote, Coptic, Christian, Egyptian origin. Former co-host of Today's Show, Hoda Kotb, ditto. Uh, you have many Arab Americans who have entered the halls of whiteness, particularly if they're Christians. Although Dr. Oz, who runs their Social Security and Medicare regime, is Turkish Muslim, although he considers himself to be a so-called secular Muslim. And so I'm trying to, once again, approach this question of whiteness from another perspective, a subject that I've dealt with in a number of projects.
Who's allowed to be in the club?
Exactly. And,
Again.
you know, once again, for Black people,
Mm.
they look at this and just sort of shake their heads and say,
Exactly.
you know, what's going on here? I mean,
Is there another book or two that you're working
oh,
on that you'd like to
of
share with? Yeah.
course. The next book will be out probably in early 2027, The Counter-Revolution of 1858, which looks at the Pacific Northwest, juxtaposing it with British Columbia, Canada. I spent most of last year in British Columbia. And it's a lot of Native American history in this book. But the founding father of British Columbia was a man of African ancestry, Sir James Douglas, with roots in British Guyana, for example. So that obviously gives you a lot of issues to play with. And also juxtaposing the you mentioned the phrase extractive, I think, before you began to tape. So the Hudson Bay Company, which was chartered in the late 17th century,
Yep.
just appropriately bought by a Chinese billionaire.
Yep.
In the 19th century, it was involved in extractive colonialism. The US model was settler colonialism. extractive colonialism did not necessarily envision liquidation of the indigenous population. Settler colonialism did and does, for example. And I end the book, which I find intriguing, with the reality. In the Wall Street Journal, there was a piece published a year or so ago, which was saluting, which was denigrating Canada's tendency and also Australia's tendency to have land acknowledgements, which many Native Americans are critical of because they don't think it goes far enough. In other words, we're sitting on the unceded land of the Lenape, the Cherokee, and then the guy in the Wall Street Journal said, well, I prefer Woody Guthrie. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Highlands. It's sort of, and so this ode to settler colonialism comes from the US left, which is something to
Oh,
ponder.
interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. Yeah,
Mhm.
you brought up something. I often hear um on the left, especially, their shock and surprise, or maybe that's not a bad adjective, but they're concerned with the tragedy of the genocide in Gaza.
Mm, mm, mm,
But they're not looking at the challenges that indigenous people here in America today are still facing in getting any type of freedom,
mm,
and African Americans, Black Americans, that we're trying to give freedom, and that it's been a multi-century genocide that the US regime has acted upon Black people and indigenous people. Um, and they don't, and then I make the connection that this is the same thing that Israel's doing. They started in 48, and they're just going to keep going.
mm. Well, it's interesting. One of the letters in the New York Times rebuking Mamdani, this letter writer said, what is the United States complaining about? I mean, they liquidated the indigenous, Israel's liquidated. What is this, a double standard? I mean, the implication being that
Exactly.
this anti-Semitism, you know, it is a kind of a double standard.
Yeah, of course, it's a double standard, but that's what I mean. It's like a blind spot.
Hmm.
We have a history. The U.S. has a history of doing this, not just here, but particularly here because they're settler colonialists. But they've done it all over the world.
Hmm. And I must make a point of personal privilege. As I said, I'd like to talk about stuff I haven't done yet because it gives me ideas, because sometimes I get feedback. So after I
Yep.
do the 1858 book, which will be out, as I said, in early 2027, the next book I write will be in December. Write as opposed to publish. The Long Detour, the Sino-Soviet Split and the Rise and Fall of U.S. Imperialism. I think that title encapsulates what the
Hmm.
book is about. Because we all need to talk about and think about the rise of China. As a matter of fact, one of the things I've been pointing out on my podcast is that Britain just moved the other day to renationalize British Steel, which had been bought by a Chinese entrepreneur. At the same time, the same week, the president of Indonesia called in the Moguls in that Southeast Asian nation who were mostly of Chinese ancestry, and many of whom had a key role in the rise of China's economy, saying that, you folks need to talk about redistributing the wealth. And I think that if present trends continue, there's going to be a curious sort of redistributionist agenda that has a racist edge to it or an anti-China edge to it. And one of the books I'm working on, I have to get back to that, deals with the Leo Frank case. This is the Jewish guy who's lynched in 1915 in Georgia.
Yep.
The main guy responsible for the lynching is Tom Watson. Now, many people have read Stephen Whitworth's book, which I think really needs updating. And here's a tip to scholars. There's a good archive at Chapel Hill of Tom Watson's writing. I bring him up because when he dies, he's saluted by both the Ku Klux Klan and Eugene Debs, the socialist leader. And I think that's because he was pushing a kind of exclusivist redistributionist agenda for his folk, Protestants, because he was very anti-Catholic. Matter of fact, I can't think of anybody who's written in such a hostile fashion towards the Vatican.
Mm.
And of course, he's anti-Negro because at the same time, he's calling for these redistributionist measures. He's calling for the white primary, for example. And so it's to coin a phrase, it's kind of a national socialism, or another way to put
Mhm.
it would be right-wing populism, which is
Yeah.
quite prominent. I think it's something we're going to have to confront. And looking at what happened the other day in London and Jakarta, combined with the rise of China, it's we have some complicated issues to deal with.
Yeah. I, I hear, I agree with you. I wanted to take a step back in time and sort of talk about one of your earlier books.
Mm,
I think I heard you talk about it recently. Black and Red, Du Bois and
mm,
the African
mm,
American Response to the Cold War,
mm,
1944 to 1963.
mhm.
You want to share your thoughts about
Well,
that?
that's my first book. The 40th anniversary edition will be out next month, August 2026. Uh, I'm dealing in that book with a number of issues. One, this apparent anomaly of civil rights being expanded, anti-Jim Crow measures, as civil liberties are being crushed, McCarthyism, the Red Scare, anti-communism, as Black internationalists are tossed overboard, Du Bois, Robeson, and their comrades, with the assistance of liberals, NAACP leadership, the ACLU leadership, the AFL-CIO leadership, for example, and then how that has brought us to this perilous point we face today. Uh, that book came out 40 years ago, but and I'm happy to say that there has been a kind of follow-on scholarship with regard to that book. Uh, that is to say, many books in that vein. That's what you hope to do. For example, the 1776 book, I think it's fair to say, has influenced the Cole Hannah-Jones 1619 project. Uh, my book, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism, Black Slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War, has influenced Keto Swan of George Washington and his books dealing with the Black experience in Papua New Guinea and the South Seas in general. So that's what you like to do. And I'm hoping that some of the projects I'm working on now, let's see, what have I forgot? I forgot to mention my book that I'm working on now on Mississippi slavery. Uh, my roots are in Mississippi. That's where my parents were both born. And I'm having to deal with the indigenous question. And because one of the more powerful forces, interestingly enough, in the Magnolia State was the Choctaw leader, Greenwood LaFleur. And I found that out when I did my book on Panthers and communists in Southern California in the 60s and 70s, armed
Mhm.
struggle, question mark. Because the lawyer, the leading lawyer for the left during the Smith Act cases in the 1950s through Angela Davis and the Black Panthers
Mhm. Mhm.
was Leo Branton, who, you have these peculiar definitions. He's called Black, but he's really descended from the Choctaws, basically.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
then tracing Leo Branton is what led me to Greenwood LaFleur, which then led me into this Mississippi slavery book.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Um, One of the ideas that I thought of, and I wanted to get your thoughts, is that the Heritage Foundation was formed. I think
Mm.
it sort of was formed out of the thinking of the Supreme Court justice that wrote the Powell memo.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is there a think tank like the Heritage Foundation that would be for Black liberation?
Ah, well, good luck with that. I thought, well, there are a number of left-wing think Institute for Policy Studies, which then has Black staff or
Mhm.
has had Black staff. I think Bill Fletcher Jr. used to be affiliated with IPS. The Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies is a kind of Black think tank. dealing with contemporary political and economic questions. But the problem with the Joint Center is like the problem with the NAACP. They don't want to recognize how the Black liberals achieved a certain kind of hegemony in the Black community. Now, you don't want to complain too much because given the strength of the right, you always get a little nervous critiquing liberals because you need these people to be part of the anti-fascist coalition. And people don't like to be criticized and then asked to join your coalition or our coalition, I should say, excuse me. But certainly, if you're thinking about starting such a think tank, I'm all for it.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I wanted to end up, we got about, 9 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at your Around the Horn, and I love it
Mm-hmm.
because it goes global. And so I can
Mm-hmm.
just sit back and go through. And one of the things I didn't see on it, but that I read about, forgot where I read about it, but it talked about what's going on between Rwanda and the Congo over
Mm-hmm.
lithium. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I remember Biden making a 100-year contract with Rwanda to buy lithium, the, for the United States to buy lithium from Rwanda. But my question is, do you know anything about the dynamics between Rwanda and the Congo?
Well, we talked about that once or twice. I haven't talked about it as much as I should, in part because Rwanda has been intervening at the request of the government of Mozambique to fight religious zealots in the north of the country, in Cabo Delgado province. And if you're a cynic, or perhaps even if you're not a cynic, you would say that Rwanda may be doing that because Total of France, the energy corporation, has investments there. But for whatever the case, these religious zealots were wreaking havoc in northern Mozambique, and Rwanda intervened. Now, before Rwanda intervened, you had some years ago the Zimbabwean military that intervened as well. And so perhaps because of that, uh, I haven't been mentioning that as much, that is to say, the Congo episode as much as I should. And thanks for mentioning that because now I'll feel compelled to address it. But and then Rwanda's also been the recipient of deportees from the United States,
Hmm. Hmm.
along with Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, for example. Uh, so Rwanda, is playing a very complicated role in both African politics and I would say global politics.
Yeah, that's why I was asking the question. It's sort of hard to figure out really what's going on there.
Mm,
The other question is about Nigeria.
mm.
I'm under the impression they have one of the largest slave trades or slave labor camps. I'm not sure what to call it, but that's just like one of the many dynamics that's going on in Nigeria. So I wonder if you could shed any light on it.
Well, with regard to Nigeria, it's the most populous nation on the continent. Nigerian nationals are being bedeviled right now in South Africa. Main target for the xenophobes, including Mozambicans, too, by the way. Hollywood has not been innocent with regard to District 9, a film I do not recommend, which is a kind of science fiction parable that portrays Nigerians in South Africa as rapacious aliens, for example. I think it helps to generate xenophobia. Uh, Nigeria is a major oil producer. Nigeria also is bedeviled by religious zealots. Uh, you may recall, I think it was in December 2025, that was one of the countries that Mr. Trump chose to bomb, presumably at the behest of the government. Uh, Nigeria apparently intervened in the internal affairs of neighboring Benin in conjunction with French neocolonialists to help to hamper regime change. So the problem with dealing with a country like Nigeria is it's so many that Around the Horn show. It's about 28 minutes. We usually do 5 or 6 segments. And it's easier, and from our point of view as well, probably uh, more politically important to attack the U.S. role in Iran, the proxy war in Ukraine, what I've been talking about on this segment, this problem with dealing with the rise of China, for example. For example, a week or two ago, we dealt with the visit of the Prime Minister of Japan to New Delhi, which obviously has as a subtext an anti-China agenda, which very well may prevail in the 21st century. And so I thought it was important to alert the audience to that so they can keep an eye on that sort of thing. So, but once again, I'll take your advice and devote more attention to Nigeria.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, but I trust yourself. Do what's I like your own priorities. And I guess I would end with is the U.S.-Iran war. Any thoughts
Mm.
about what's going on?
Well, I think I mentioned how these Israeli elites are rather comfortable with what's going on right now. Uh, Mr. Trump has started another forever war. And as I said, I listen to a lot of these podcasts, particularly from our European friends. And I recall in the run-up to November 2024 elections, they really swallowed whole hog this idea that Mr. Trump was an anti-interventionist. I'm talking about people on the left, for example, because they really don't understand U.S. politics. As I said to another commentator, they see the United States as like a Western European country that just happens to have a lot of black people, basically. But uh, just I mentioned a few moments ago about the difference between the Francophone world and the Anglo world, U.S., Britain, and the so-called revolutions implicating the slave trade, whereas the French Revolution leads in the 1790s to abolition. And then fast forward today, Mélenchon uh, of the left is a credible candidate to become the next president, whereas the United States, with all due respect for my friends on the left, I'm not sure if we'll be able to develop a credible left-wing social democratic candidate to challenge for the White House in 2028. And I think it has a lot to do, Lenin spoke about the labor aristocracy with regard to Britain. That same concept could be applied to the United States, for example, the unpaid sector of the working class versus the settler descendant working class, the Staten Island question, as I put it prosaically. And so uh, I think I'm confident that we'll be able to deal with these contradictions and conundrums because if we don't, we'll have a lot to discuss in the concentration camps.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to just, I know I shouldn't, but I want one last thought. How do you think the elections are going to go? You think Trump is going to,
In the United States.
in the United States, the upcoming
Yeah, you
November
saw it
election?
last night. He put on this Trump 28 hat. And you saw the speech we mentioned where he suggested any election that his side does not win is fraudulent. Uh, he suggested previously that because of so-called interference by the deep state, he deserves another term in office.
There you go. There you go.
And people need to deal with the fact, as I said, he has a mass base. I don't care how you torture the numbers and make them scream that Trump doesn't have a mass base. Well, I'm afraid he does have a mass base. And so then the question becomes, how do you explain it? I mean, now I think you have difficulty explaining it once you throw up a great wall between the past and the present. Great leap forward in 1776 to the verge of neo-fascism in 2026 with no connection between the two. A tree without roots, for example. It's really unscientific and makes no sense. And as I said, it endangers us all.
Well, thank you. We ended at 1 hour exactly, so that's perfect. So I
Right on.
appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you on our next conversation.
Yeah, send me the link.
Absolutely, we'll send you the link. Take care.
Good luck to you.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The concrete wears the stories of the feet that never rested. A social contract broken and a justice system tested. We're tracing lines in the dust where the giants used to stand, building up a blueprint for a long-awaited land. It's a rhythm in the marrow, it's a whisper in the wind, knowing where the struggle stops and where the truths begin. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. The metaphor of shadows is the comfort of the blind, but we're breaking through the static of a cultivated mind. Every voice is a brushstroke on a canvas, painted colors of a different kind of day. Urgency is not a fire, it's a slow and steady flame, keeping us from forgetting why we ever started the game. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. Metaphor in motion, urgency in the air. Are you listening? Are you there? The rhythm remains, the reflection continues. Stay aware. Peace.